Alright guys, welcome to your Lecture 2 Part 2 video for this week. I want to start with a brief overview of our weekly outline. We have a short week this week, so that means you have a little bit shorter of a workload, a little bit lighter. Monday, you do not have school unless you choose to be watching this on Monday. You don't have to watch your lecture until Tuesday this week. Wednesday, we'll get on for online class. Thursday, you should reserve some time for the Unit 2 readings. Notice those first those first four readings, the 4D, 5B, 6C, and 7B, those are going to be from the ushistory.org website that is linked in Teams. That's in the general channel. And then the second reading there, The Emergence of New Ideas, is a PDF in your Unit 2-3 channel under readings in the files that you can find there. Any trouble finding those readings, please let me know. Notice on Friday it says work on paper 2. Your second paper is due this week. That's why you have a little bit lighter of a workload. Remember, that is 350 to 700 words on a question of your choice. Those questions can be found in two places: in your outline for Unit 2 and 3 down at the bottom, and they can be found in the assignment portal for your paper 2. Make sure that you go back and look at the comments from your short paper 1 in order to avoid making the same mistakes in the second paper. All right, I think that's enough housekeeping for this week. As always, any questions on anything, please don't hesitate to reach out and we can clear up any confusion. All right, section 4. We last left off with an overview of the three different types of colonies that we have. Remember, we have New England colonies, middle colonies, southern colonies, each with different economies, different conditions as far as weather and climate and all that good stuff goes. And we also started talking a little bit about the people that we are taking this land from. What we're going to get into today is different developments such as government in the colonies and events that took place, important colonial figures. So we're going to move through section 4 and section 5 in this video. All right, to start, governing in the colonies. When we look at government in the colonies, in the very beginning, we are going to see that the colonies get established. They begin by establishing their own representative forms of government, and those forms of government will be reflective on where they came from. You have to think about all the settlers coming into the colonies were from England. When they look at the government that they're moving away from, there are certain aspects that they did really like that they wanted to keep and bring with them into the colonies. First and foremost, what they're going to see that they enjoyed in the British government is the idea of a limited monarchy. They're going to look at Parliament and take pieces of that representative form of government and stick that over in the colonies. You're going to see that they like to elect officials to represent their ideas in a larger government, just like Parliament. Specifically, when we move to the Constitution, which we're getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit there, you're going to see Parliament heavily reflected in the Constitution. The idea of a two-house legislature, just like Parliament, an upper and a lower, with the House of Commons versus the representation of the nobles in Parliament. Same idea. So we like this idea of a limited ruler over in the colonies, just as they had seen from whence they came. The Magna Carta, the idea proposed in the Magna Carta that the colonists are going to hang tight on, is the idea that the king over in England could not tax the people without representation, without their permission. So there had to be some sort of a conversation within this representative government before the king could place taxes on the people in England, as said in the Magna Carta. The colonists are going to sink their teeth into that idea, and moving forward, they're really, really going to hold tight to that and use it as a bargaining chip when taxes start being established. Now, the colonists also will take with them the idea of traditional English rights. We're going to see this come up in a specific event, but rights such as a fair trial, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. This is all going to be found in the English Bill of Rights that the colonists will want to take with them, because at the end of the day, the colonists are going to believe that they are Englishmen. Okay, they came from England, they want to retain those rights, and they want to be treated as such. So that goes all the way back to when they're forming these governments in the colonies. The idea of salutary or benign neglect is something that's going to happen right from the get. And this picture over here on your slide is one of my favorites. Salutary neglect or benign neglect is the description that the king turned a blind eye to the governments being formed within the colonies in the beginning. When you neglect something, you don't pay attention to it. You're not taking care of it. Now, it's not that the king was not paying attention to the protection of the colonies. That was very much on the forefront. But as far as the governing of the colonies went, as far as severe trade restrictions on the colonies went, the king turned a blind eye. He put his sunglasses on and turned away from the colonies in the beginning. He allowed for these governments that we'll talk about in just a second to be formed. He allowed the colonies to have some control over what was happening. He allowed for them to sneakily trade with other places as well. There wasn't as much attention paid to the colonies in the beginning because they were making money. The whole goal here was for the colonies to be established to benefit England. And in the beginning, they were. So, as far as the king was concerned, everything else kind of fell by the wayside. And you can see salutary neglect being established in the beginning as we talk about these forms of government coming up. And that will severely affect how the colonies interact with England moving forward when some of these restrictions are taken away. And we'll see that to come. Virginia House of Burgesses is one of these forms of government that I have been blabbering on about. The Virginia House of Burgesses is going to be established in 1619. What this really was a legislature of the New World. You are going to see that burgesses, which is just a fancy old way of saying representatives, were selected from these large settlements or plantations by the people to go in and have discussions on behalf of the people. We're going to see that this is a law-making body. There is going to be taxes set by the Virginia House of Burgesses, and you'll see that it's made up of 22 elected burgesses or representatives to represent 11 plantations. So for each plantation or settlement, there were 2 elected officials. This should be sounding extremely familiar. It's really ringing some bells with the Senate, 2 for every state. And here we have 2 for every settlement, every plantation. The governor is going to be George Yeardley, and what this does is it sets a precedent or an example moving forward on how we're going to handle happenings within the colonies. This is going to be one of the first forms of representative governments within the colonies. Now, it's not that the king didn't know that this was happening. The king was aware, but the king allowed this to happen to let the colonies rule themselves, to let the colonies represent and solve their problems within the colonies. And very interestingly enough, the first order of business was to set a minimum price for the sale of tobacco. So here you see even having some major powers such as that moving forward. the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact is going to be another piece of representative forms of government within the colonies. You're going to see separatists from England coming over on the Mayflower. These are going to be Puritans that are crossing the Atlantic looking to establish the Plymouth colony, which they settle on the shore of Massachusetts Bay. On the way over, there is no charter formed out by the king. There was a huge question of who would rule. How are we going to figure this out? What will the government look like? And the answer to that question comes with the Mayflower Compact being signed on the ship on the way over in 1620. What this does is it comes up with a plan, an agreement that outlines a form of self-government. This is going to be labeled a republic because the Puritans were, in a sense, electing their governor, their deputy governor, their assembly, and it was based on a majority rule. So these decisions would be made all together. This just shows the forward thinking of the Puritans, of the settlers coming over to the colonies to have this taken care of before they even land. They know we need to establish some form of leadership in order to make these colonies successful. Another form of representative government that we need to talk about are the New England town meetings. New England town meetings are going to be used in the New England colonies, and what they do is they're a public forum where people could come in and discuss disputes between the people. So this was more of a common, open discussion amongst the people in the New England colonies on a smaller scale, where people could go and talk about things like land disputes or border disputes, anything that they could come up with, maybe changing laws, any other issues that they could come up with to really open this up to the public and have this open conversation. And a final, this isn't in your slide right here, but a final name to note when it comes to representative forms of government is going to be the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. This is going to be a document that is formatted very similar to the Constitution. There will be a preamble, and then there's going to be a following 11 orders and laws. What this does, this document gives a base when we go to write the Constitution of what the heck does this form of government on paper is supposed to be outlined like. And what the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut also outlined was general meetings of the courts and a legislative, executive, judicial, and administrative authority that was given to what they titled as the General Court. So you can see some semblance of a government being formed there as well. And these four examples, the Virginia House of Burgesses, the Mayflower Compact, New England town meetings, and Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, are four forms of representative governments within the colonies that are all allowed to happen under the policy of salutary or benign neglect. The king was allowing these governments to form. It was allowing the colonists to govern themselves to a point in the beginning because they were making money. They were successful. Triangular trade. You may remember this from Global. This might ring some bells. But in 1619, we're going to have the first slave ships arrive in Jamestown, Virginia, solving the labor issue within the colonies. Now, I say labor issue because when we're thinking about these southern plantations, these vast, huge plantations in the South, we have to think of who the heck is going to work on them. Now, if you know anything about business, the most expensive piece of running a business is your labor. Now, the settlers, the colonists, and the king are all going to be very well aware of that. In the South, on the plantations, remember, we have those cash crops beginning with tobacco, and we want to make the most money possible. So how do you make the most money possible when it comes to plantations? You have to have cheap labor. And in this case, when we bring in slave ships, we have free labor. And that solves the issue of needing a lot of people to work on these plantations and saving money on having laborers there. Now, the idea of triangular trade comes in when we look at the trade from Europe to Africa and Africa to the colonies and back and forth between them. So if we just break down the first bit there and we look at trade from Europe to Africa, Europe is trading to Africa things such as iron products, which would include weapons and anything that they could not manufacture for themselves. Because remember, over in Europe, we see the Industrial Revolution, those manufacturing centers already having happened. Africa is going to trade back to Europe and over into the colonies slaves and gold. And when we look at what the colonies are trading to Africa, you're going to see products like rum and other iron products. Then you're going to see the colonies trading with England, with Europe, the fish and whale oil coming from the New England colonies, lumber coming from the middle colonies, and tobacco coming from the southern colonies. And also you can see that England is trading with the colonies, and what they're trading back to the colonies are manufactured products, those manufactured goods such as teas, furniture, cloth, tools, spices. All of that is going to go from Europe into the colonies. So the main things that we have going on here are manufactured goods coming out of Europe, slaves coming out of Africa, and raw materials coming out of the colonies. And triangular trade here is where we're going to see each of these different sections of the triangle benefit from what they give and from what they take in other places. And you guys probably remember the pathway from Africa to the colonies used to be labeled the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage being that very awful long journey between Africa to the colonies, where we would pack as many slaves as possible onto these ships to save money in an attempt to save money, because those trips were long and they were expensive, and the slaves were not paying for their way. Instead, the money that they were sold for would have to cover their payment there, and they would have to then move on to whatever plantation or wherever they were supposed to be working once they got there. Indentured servants. When we talk about the other solution to the labor problem, that is going to be indentured servants. So what the heck is a servant? Well, that is somebody that works for another person. And I want to highlight that word servant because, as you saw in your readings from last week, there is a big difference between indentured servants and a slave. The difference here being is we had people from England that could not afford their fare to come over to the colonies. They were English poor. So what they would do is make an agreement with a wealthier settler to go over to the colonies and have their trip paid for, and their repayment would come from working, doing whatever over in the colonies to pay back their travel pay. So you'd have a poor Englishman who wanted to go to the New World, couldn't afford it, somebody else would pay for it, and upon arrival to the colonies, that English poor would work off their payment. Now, they would sign an agreement where they would have to work for about 5 to 7 years, doing anything that was asked of them by the person that paid their way. Now, during that time that they were working, they would have food supplied to them, clothing and shelter, but we're not living in the Taj Mahal eating 5-course meals every night. If you remember from the reading, these conditions were terrible. people were not being fed an extreme amount. They were getting the bare minimum. The shelter, not that great, getting the bare minimum. Everything was the bare minimum. So if you were an indentured servant and you could survive that 5 to 7 years of kind of awful treatment, then you would be released. And that is the highlight in the difference between slavery and an indentured servant, because you had the possibility for freedom. If you survived that time that you agreed upon to work, then you would be released, sometimes given a small plot of land, most of the time just given the clothes on your back and some bare essentials to survive the immediate release, and you could start your life in the new world. What this highlights, though, is indentured servants really showed that desperation to reach the new world, that plea to get to a point where they could start a new life, chasing after this. It's not the American dream yet, but chasing after this dream of creating a new life and creating a new story for yourself in a new place. Mercantilism. Mercantilism should be a word that we have heard before, but this is a belief that states that a nation or an empire could build wealth and power by developing its industries and exporting manufactured goods in exchange for raw materials. So the whole purpose of mercantilism is for a mother country, in this case England, to establish colonies that would provide raw materials that could not be found in the mother country. You've got to think, England is an island. They have, not a huge variation in climate across the island. They can't grow everything. They can't produce all products. They have to find somewhere that they can get that from. Now, when establishing the colonies, you want to take the raw materials and make manufactured goods, which you would then sell to other empires and to the colonies for more money. This is the relationship between England and the colonies, and the purpose for England of establishing the colonies was raw materials. It was also to establish new trading markets. So England would take from the colonies raw materials and the cheap labor of the people within the colonies doing the hard work. They would take those raw materials, make them into manufactured goods, and then sell them back at a more expensive price to the colonies and to other empires. England did very well with this. They were increasing their exports and decreasing their imports. They were not importing these raw materials from other empires anymore. Instead, they were just taking them from the colonies, which was saving England money on imports, and they were making even more money on their exports of manufactured goods. England benefited and profited the most from the relationship with the colonies. The definition of mercantilism cannot be described better than the relationship between England and the colonies. The New England colonies offered up the fish industry and those rich harbors where the trade could happen. So you see fish and whale oil coming out of the New England colonies. In the middle colonies, you have lumber coming out. And in the southern colonies, you have those cash crops starting with tobacco. All of what was found in the colonies was not something that we had readily available in England. So they were getting not only differentiated raw materials from the colonies, but exactly what they were importing from other rival empires. And remember, England wants to make the most money, and if they had to trade with other empires and give them money, that's a no-no. That is not good. Instead, they want to take it from the colonies and sell those manufactured goods to their rival empires to make the most money. So mercantilism, the relationship between England and the colonies, best defines it. Stick that in your brain. And we are moving on to section 5. We already started to touch on religion in the colonies a little bit, but I want to go back and really delve in just a little bit deeper to the religion that we see in the colonies and some events that go along with it, because it aids in our understanding of the progression of the colonies. First of all, Native American religion. I find this highly fascinating, and it's something that is often forgotten when we do U.S. history. So let's just spend a little bit of time on it here. Native American religion sees time as an eternal loop. Now, maybe you've studied this in other religions where one life ends and another begins. There is no true ending to one life because you can be reborn in another. And that creation was holistic. Everything was created by the different gods, but all as a part of the same story. There is a natural harmony to the world. Every piece has its place. There are many different cogs in the wheel that we see in this natural harmony. Taking out one piece disrupts the entire show. Native Americans also see knowledge from their dreams. They see it as a way of predicting what may happen, warnings to come, and the good things that may be coming, ways to prepare for the future. They really read into any dreams that are reported on by their people. Also, they see God being present in all. So it's in all people, it's in all living things, it's in nature around us. God is everywhere. It's not just one specific place that we see God, it is in everything. Death in the Native American religion is not a sad time. It is the culmination of life. Once you reach death, that doesn't have to be the end. Your whole life builds into death, and everything that you do, every decision that you make decides what death actually means in your life. And Native American religion, we see a lot of ritual. It is very ritualistic. There is, as you can see in the picture there, that is a Native American ritual. But there are harvest rituals, there are rituals for hunting and different seasons, welcoming in the different seasons, and birth and in death, and in healing rituals. It is a very ritualistic society. And I say all of this about Native American religion in the hopes that we see that Native Americans were not the savages depicted by the settlers upon coming here, or the explorers before them. It was that they were different. They were vastly different from what the settlers had known before, and that makes them unknown, and it makes them scary. And what we fear, we don't understand, and often we don't take the time to understand, which can leave the Native Americans in a dangerous, vulnerable position in their relationship with the settlers coming in. The Puritans. You got to read a little bit about the Puritans in your City Upon a Hill reading from last week. We call them radical Calvinists. This comes from John Calvin. He was a Reformed Protestant. What he did is he was a lawyer that created a very legalistic rationale for everything that was happening. He said there was a God sovereignty. There was no free will. Everything was predetermined by God. There is a special plan for each person. Puritans are going to be obsessed with this Calvinistic idea of life, and being obsessed with finding out what path did God put them on. Were they going to heaven? Were they predestined for heaven? Or were they predestined for hell? And this is going to be something that the Puritans bring over with them to the New World. And these tensions to be the best, to be number one, to be that city upon a hill, is going to put them into a work mindset, but it will also be very hard to understand. That question of which one am I? Am I in the good group or am I in the bad group? Will anything that I do determine or change my pathway? Starts to drive them a little crazy. You read a little bit about John Winthrop in 1630 taking the lead in among the Puritans, wanting to have that city upon a hill, have everybody look up to this perfect society. Um, I hate to burst this bubble, but we probably should now. I mentioned it slightly in the lecture last Wednesday, but there were no pilgrims, there were Puritans. These are going to be your separatist group that wants to purify the Church of England upon their arrival to the New World. There is zero religious freedom. There is no democracy when it comes to the Puritans. They believe that if you work hard, you will be rewarded by God, and the reward from God will come in the form of money and success. Um, in triangular trade, they realized that money meant that God liked you. So what they did was invest in making ships that would trade with England. They would send sugar over to England for guns, which were then taken to Africa for slaves to be brought back and traded for tobacco in the South. Now, all trade was technically illegal, but the Puritans kind of saw a way around this by saying taxes are taking our hard-earned money, and that money was rewarded to us by God. So they get this twinge of a rebellious attitude and start to participate in this trade because they didn't like the taxes. Remember, God showed that He liked you through the money that you were given. Now, if this government is taking away your money, you've got to find a different way to make money. So they participated in triangular trade in order to kind of get back what they felt was earned to them. So there was that touch of rebellious nature. That's about the only part of the Puritans that were rebellious. A little bit interesting to think about that in that way, but it was all in the name of God. Anything to protect the money that would illustrate success in the eyes of God. Now, when we look at religion across the colonies, we are going to see that New England colonies are going to be known for the Puritans, who I was just talking about. The middle colonies are going to be the Quakers that you've heard before. They're going to be the Dutch Reformed Calvinists and the Anabaptists. The point in looking at these different religions to be seen in the middle colonies is to show that religious freedom. And in the southern colonies, you'll see the Church of England, but there really is an absence of religion in the southern colonies because they're so spread out. Where people were was on these plantations that were miles and miles and miles away from each other. So there was no cohesive religion in the southern colonies. Instead, it was just kind of whatever the people practiced. And whatever they carried out in their own homes, really. So even in religion, just like in economy, the colonies are going to have a very different take on what they practice. Now, to move into one big event that we see in the colonies is the First Great Awakening. Now, as time moved forward, we are going to see that, like I just said, in the South, there's kind of not a lack of religion, but a lack of a cohesive religion. The Puritans in the New England colonies are going to be very strict. The middle colonies being very practice whatever you would like. And this movement away from a strict religion in some of the colonies is going to expose a weakness, a weak spot. And you're going to see people like Jonathan Edwards come in and try to inspire religion throughout the colonies to unite the people. And he will give a speech where he includes the idea of sinners at the hand of an angry God. And this was meant to emphasize the teaching that hell was in fact real. It was a place that actually existed. And the language that he used in his sermon, he was hoping to awaken his audience to the horrific reality that would await them should they try to continue a life without calling on Christ to be saved. So Jonathan Edwards with this sermon is just one of the many examples of these preachers that would go around and talk to very large groups of people, as you can see in the picture there, hoping to inspire a great awakening among the people, hoping to inspire the people to find a connection with God, and saying that if you did, once you did, then you could, not only could you avoid hell, but you could be successful as well. Now, the important pieces to highlight with the Great Awakening here is that it was a democratic movement, and this is huge. All could participate, even African Americans. Everybody could find acceptance in the eyes of God when attending these sermons. And the reason that that is so big is because we begin this idea that everybody should be equal under God. Now, what you would see is people who attended these were looking to be saved. They were looking to form an emotional connection to God. And the people giving these sermons would, in fact, say, everybody could have an emotional connection to God. It didn't matter what you did. It didn't matter who you were, what age you were, what race you were. Everybody had that opportunity. And this is all going to come on the heels of the scientific revolution, which was beginning to push people away from their religious beliefs. And these people like John Edwards would speak to these large populations of colonists to hope to increase attendance at local churches and inspire the colonists to want to be saved. What it ends up doing, though, is inspiring this idea that colonists should be equal under God, and if they're equal under God, they should be equal under their government. Being equal under their government is huge and will come up as we get closer to the Revolutionary War, because at this moment, we are going to see the colonists start to open their eyes that they, in fact, are not being treated equally under their government by the king. Some Enlightenment thinkers that are going to heavily influence the colonists' way of thinking. These should be people that we remember from years past. John Locke, the natural rights theory, stating that people have natural rights just for being people. Okay, these are rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness now, but property were originally what John Locke had proposed. And because you are a living, breathing human being, you have these natural rights. Another Enlightenment thinker that heavily influences the colonies is Rousseau with the social contract theory. And this is incredibly interesting. Rousseau stated that there is a social contract between the people and between their government. And that social contract was that the people agreed to give up certain rights to their government to allow that government to govern. So it was a give and take relationship. The people would give up rights that the government would then not take, I don't want to say take, but protect and hold in order to govern effectively the people within their borders. And that social contract theory is going to come up when we get closer into the Declaration of Independence and the formation of our Constitution. Montesquieu. I like to remember Montesquieu because his last name is 3 syllables. If you go all the way back to where you used to clap out your syllables in elementary school, Montesquieu has 3 syllables, Montesquieu. And the reason I stress that is because he brings up the idea of separation of powers in the government, a limited government, something that we had really appreciated over in England and something that we will continue to push within the colonies, a separation of powers, moving away from that one all-powerful ruler, that we want a government that respects the people. These Enlightenment thinkers are going to become very important very soon to us. A couple of important figures that we want to take a peek at in the colonies. First and foremost, John Peter Zenger. I need you to put a huge star next to John Peter Zenger because this case highlights a right that the people will come to hold dear, especially in our present time, 2020. John Peter Zenger was the editor of the New York Weekly Journal, and what Zenger did as the editor would approve any of the articles that were to be printed in this journal, this newspaper type. One such article that he will print exposed the royal governor. Remember, a royal governor was one that was put in power by the king. A royal governor collected taxes from the people and was kind of the eyes on the ground of the king who could not be there in the colonies. Now, this article about the royal governor, William S. Cosby, accused the royal governor of being corrupt, exposed all of his practices, taking money, not respecting the colonists, kind of infringing on their rights. And this article was printed in the New York Weekly Journal. Now, as you can imagine, that created some problems for Cosby, and he became angry. Cosby then accused Zenger of libel, which is defined as printing information that opposed the government, and that is or was illegal. So Zenger is taken to court, and the jury looks at the case and says, okay, yes, Zenger quite literally is guilty of libel, of printing information that opposed the government, opposed that royal governor, but we are going to say that he is not guilty because that's a crappy law, and the press should have the freedom to check the power of the government. So this is the first case that we see freedom of the press be used to protect the people and their rights, to allow them to be aware of whatever the government is doing. This is also a case of jury nullification, and this is incredibly interesting because juries, and in this case in particular, had the opportunity to go against a law that they really didn't like. If we look at this case, Zenger was guilty. He did print that article, and that article was against the government. It did oppose the government. But the jury decided that the law was bad and instead found him not guilty when in fact there was evidence that he was guilty. So John Peter Zenger shows us the importance of freedom of the press in the colonies pre-Bill of Rights time period that will push through the colonies in years to come. Another important colonial figure that we need to note is Benjamin Franklin. He is an inventor. He comes up with the bifocal reading glasses. Thank you, Benny. I wear those. Anybody else who does, thank him. He is also credited with his work for electricity and his creation of an efficient wood-burning stove. He founded the College of Philadelphia, which is now the University of Pennsylvania. He was a delegate at the First Continental Congress and then became a diplomat around the world. This allowed for him to show in his role at the First Continental Congress ideas from the western side of the Atlantic in discussions of our new government that would come to be. He is also a key figure in the Albany Plan of Union. The Albany Plan of Union is that photograph that you see of the snake cut into many pieces with the phrase join or die. This plan is going to be proposed in 1754 and had attempted to bring the colonial rivals together to kind of go against the common threat of the French and the Indians, who were posing much problems to the colonies. And what this plan does is it was meant to bring the colonies together and show that together they are stronger, where apart they are weaker, and create one union of the British colonies. When we see the Albany Plan of Union being proposed, only 7 colonies are going to send commissioners to discuss the Plan of Union proposed to the colonies. The colonial governments were supposed to, under this plan, select members that would attend a Grand Council, while the British government would appoint a President General. Together, these two branches were meant to, or supposed to, unify the governments and regulate colonial and Indian relations, and to resolve any territorial disputes between the colonies. Now, this presented its own problems because the colonies at this point had already adapted their own governments separately. They enjoyed those governments, and this government would acknowledge a tendency of a royal colonial governor and have them have the ability to override colonial legislatures, which would allow them to pursue unpopular policies. And that's not okay. We don't like that. The Albany Plan gave the Grand Council even greater power to the relative authority. So, what we're saying here is at the moment, before joining the Albany Plan of Union, royal governors had the ability to override colonial legislatures, which they didn't like. If they joined the Albany Plan of Union, the Grand Council would have even greater powers to override what the colonial legislatures and what the colonists wanted. So the plan didn't really work. The colonists don't enjoy it. Colonial governments sensed that it would take away power from them and take away territorial rights from them, and they either just rejected the plan altogether, or some of the colonies decided not to act at all. While the intention was kind of good, the Albany Plan wanted to kind of protect the colonies from the French and the Indians. It just didn't come to fruition. But what's important to note is that the Albany Plan of Union was not meant to join the colonies against Great Britain. We're not there yet. This was literally just to get the colonies together under the control of Great Britain, and kind of push them forward together under the control of Great Britain. And that's going to be supported and pushed heavily by Benjamin Franklin. What this really does show, and what we need to note Benjamin Franklin for, is how politically versed he was from his time as a diplomat traveling around the world. We're going to see him participate in the Albany Plan of Union and moving forward to really shape what our nation comes to look like. So these are two very important colonial figures that we want to look out for. And then next time we meet, we're going to take on the French and Indian War, and we will take on the Revolutionary War. So next lecture, all about war. Don't forget to reference back to your weekly outline and approach me with any questions that you have.